the next one, and I'll invite the panel members to come and join me on stage. While they do, I'll just set the scene. The next one is about the utility death spiral. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the origins of the term utility death spiral, it is a phrase from the US market. I think it started in the early years of the last decade, particularly in a paper that the Edison Electric Institute, the sort of trade association for the electricity industry, popularized. And the idea was that people were going to start to defect from the grid, even though in those days, renewable costs were clearly not as competitive as they are today, but they were going to start to defect from the grid. Obviously, the US was doing it in a different environment from Africa. The US was doing it in an environment where, number one, almost all utilities were privatized already. Number two, almost all utilities had already unbundled all of their generation, not all, but a large number had unbundled all of their generation to private players. Number three, there was a very high rate of electrification, and yet they foresaw defection. And defection was going to do two things. First of all, it was going to leave them with legacy power generation assets that people didn't want to use anymore. And secondly, more seriously, there was the risk that it was going to mean that the grid itself was no longer going to be viable because people weren't going to want to use the grid, and as the volume of grid usage went down, it still needed to be paid for. So there was this concept that utilities would gradually get into this financial death spiral, despite their health, despite their high levels of electrification already, that they would gradually get into that death spiral of not being sustainable. Now, clearly in the US, that hasn't really happened. But we're here looking at the African continent, at a range of different countries, some of which have fairly high electrification, the majority of which we would all agree do not, the majority of which are state-owned, the majority of which have not unbundled much generation, and where the demand for new investment is extremely high compared to a market like the US. So I'd like to ask the next panel members, those who are around, I hope there's somewhere here, come and join me on stage, please. I think we're all now assembled. Thank you again to the audience members for waiting while everyone got mic'd up. We've talked about the topic, the utility death spiral. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists. So we have Sabi Biranyi, who is Senior Investment Officer from Sunfunder, which is a specialist funder across the region. We have Zohrab Mawani, who is founder and director of African Energy Development Corporation as a developer, and particularly renowned for having got off one of the first large-scale solar projects in Kenya off the ground. We have Jasper Graf from Hardenberg, who is CEO of Daystar Power, which has been involved across many African countries in the renewable space, and Leslie Labruto, Global Head of Energy at Acumen, which has been involved in a wide range of portfolio issues. And Leslie, I must say, when I look at the limited amount of capital available for Africa, I do love seeing on your resume that you worked for a VC firm that had $15 billion available in the US. And I'm thinking of the day when we can stand up and talking about African funds that have $15 billion. So I hope we'll get there. But with that, over to the panel. We've chatted a little bit about what the issue is. And so maybe the question is the utility death spiral relevant? And Leslie, you'd like to kick off?
I'd be happy to. So just by way of quick introduction, my name is Leslie. I work at Acumen Fund. We're the largest off-grid equity investor in the world for low-income customers. We've invested in over 30 energy access companies, started investing in the sector in about 2007. And it's been quite a journey. I think we've learned a lot about what the off-grid sector and just in general electrification in Africa looks like. So is it relevant? I think that's a really great question, and of course it's relevant. Utility margins and capital is incredibly difficult to balance books, and when you look at who we're trying to serve with power, we have low-income customers who draw down on very little demand, and quintessentially why you need alternative forms of power like off-grid solar and mini-grids is because utilities just fundamentally, it doesn't make any economic sense to connect some of these customers. They're too far, they're too remote, and they're too poor. So it's just not going to make sense for a utility to go reach those customers. But then the question becomes, well, what do you do if you want to reach SDG 7 universal electrification by 2030? Do you look to utilities like we have in developed markets, or do you look at alternative sources of power and provisions in order to electrify those people? And I think very quickly you realize that the least cost solution is not extending the grid and thus making them further loss-making, but you look at alternative forms of electrification, such as mini-grids. That said, we cannot expect mini-grids to develop with venture capital dollars. We cannot expect off-grid solar to scale with just private equity funds. We need to see subsidy. We need to see strategic use of grant capital in order to see those populations electrified and utilities not go insolvent because they're stuck trying to electrify these people.
Thank you. Zora, maybe you could focus on Kenya. I mean, that's obviously where you've developed a project. Kenya's obviously got a relatively financially healthy utility and relatively well-developed one, but one that's going through some challenges now from government to cut its tariffs. What do you think the future holds?
Sure, thank you, Jonathan. Quick intro, I'm Zora Mawani. I'm based in Canada and have built a career in renewables for the last 20 years, about 1.5 gigawatts of wind and solar projects that I've led that are operating today. And so I was born in Kenya, moved to Canada when I was young. And I wanted to take this experience in North America to Kenya, back to my home country. And so I started that in 2013. I started AEDC in 2013 with a partner who is Kenyan. And we felt that we could really achieve great things. The experience in North America with utility scale projects, there were challenges, but we could get them developed and get them to construction in a relatively timely fashion. Of course, that's not the case for Africa. Unfortunately, it's quite challenging. There are some things that are fast and some things that take a lot of time. So we started Malindi Solar Project in 2013, and I was hoping to come to the conference today saying that it's achieved COD, but we're still a few weeks away. It's a 52 megawatt project that we partnered with Globelec on in 2018. We started in 2013. We're the original developer. So as a developer, I'm taking a lot of risk. I'm investing my own money. I'm not buying anyway, I won't get into the details. I'm investing my own money. It's coming out of my own pocket to develop this project. So the longer it takes to achieve positive cash flows, it's a lot of exposure for me as a developer. And so there are a lot of risks in development, and unfortunately, not just in Africa, but around the world, we see utilities as being very traditional and very old school and not looking forward, not thinking proactively about things. They have unfortunately not moved with the times in our view. And I think there's definitely the utility death spiral is very relevant all over Africa. And I see it in Kenya, even though KPLC, Kenya Power and Lighting Company, is one of the more successful utilities in Africa. It's a huge risk for them because they're not meeting the customer's needs as well as they should be. And that's a risk for every utility in the world, because if they want to stay relevant, they need to keep the customers happy, because there are a lot of disruptors in the market, developers of large scale, small scale, residential scale, solar and other renewable technologies that will come in and eat their lunch. The utilities need to stay involved and be part of the equation, or they're going to go extinct. So I think it's very, very relevant, Jonathan.
Thank you. Well, so we're not maybe at a poll of hands yet, but we are getting there, Tony. I guess I turn to Sabi next as a funder. I mean, you're focused on funding smaller projects, maybe not grid connected, but is the risk of utility financial downgrade, is it relevant to the sector?
Bit of background first. Hi everyone. So I've been investing in emerging markets for 14 years and worked in Nigeria with a distributed energy company, RenSource, before joining Sunfunder a year ago. Sunfunder itself, we've invested over the last 9 years across 19 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We have 57 borrowers across our now 4-fund portfolio, and we're raising our next fund now. So we have a a leading position from a lender's perspective for smaller scale solar energy projects in sub-Saharan Africa across countries. So the downgrade of utilities, well, I would say that what we're seeing is that there's different elements within the decentralized energy offerings, SHS, Minigrid, and otherwise, that complete the picture, the mosaic of what Africa needs as soon as possible to electrify. And whilst there is a lot of legacy attitudes and legacy approaches to the market by utilities, my personal view is that they will stick around. They will need them as well as decentralized energy solution supporters ourselves, Sunfunder. We will need them in terms of collaboration efforts. They really do need to ramp up. So I don't think, I think the death spiral is a nice catchphrase, but I think that I'm very hopeful, let's put it that way, that they will, at least in some countries, wake up and be more progressive and work together with the private sector and decentralize solutions in ways that benefit the continent.
Thank you. And last but not least, Jasper, I mean, as a developer, how do you see this impacting your business, positively or negatively?
Yeah, well, first off, in terms of introduction, so my name is Jasper. I'm the CEO of Daystar Power. We are an off-grid renewable power company, mainly active in West Africa. And I guess looking at this question, we're one of the driving forces which would cause a death spiral, because who we serve are the best paying customers of the utilities. So we serve the industrials, the big companies. We provide them with renewable energy solutions so that they can switch away from grids, which are often unreliable, have poor quality power, and often very expensive. If they're even there, very often they don't have any power available to give, and they just have to run on diesel generators. So I guess for the customers we serve, they would love to leave the grid as quickly as possible. And it's really for them, they're only looking at a more cost-effective solution to their power problems. Because what companies are facing currently in West Africa, at least, is that their power costs are significantly higher than comparable companies would have in Europe or the US. And how do we want to build economies and industrialized societies in Africa if they have power costs which are just significantly higher than the competition in the developed markets? And that's where off-grid power can come in, because through the use of solar power, renewables, but also natural gas in some instances, power costs can be driven down below grid tariffs in many markets. And that will cause a big issue for these utilities, because these are their best paying customers. Households are not as significant as a customer base in Africa as it's in Europe. So it's a real concern. I think it won't happen in every country, but there are definitely some countries where the risk is there that utilities will die.
I'm going to maybe probe into a little bit more about the different situation in different countries. And I'll talk a little bit about South Africa, which no one on the panel's mentioned, because it's one I know particularly well. And I think it is one of the most problematic cases. I mean, South Africa, for those that don't know, it has 2/3 of sub-Saharan Africa's power generating capacity. It's got by far the highest rate of electrification. Depending on how you count it, it's about 90%. And it has a utility that is facing a classic utility death spiral. It has high-cost historical generation. It has dirty generation that it's got to shut down. It's got a renewable IPP market that has already matured, and it's now just opened up to CNI and other decentralized projects of up to 100 megawatts have just been allowed. The first projects haven't happened, but they've just been, as of about 3 or 4 months ago, there's been an announcement it's going to be allowed. The regulations are being gazetted now. There's no question that Eskom is going to face one of the biggest utility death spirals in the world. On the other hand, you look at other markets in the region where I think the levels of electrification are fairly low. Therefore, the sort of burden of legacy assets, even if you've got legacy generating assets, the burden of those is relatively smaller for the sector. If we were going to sort of try and pick 1 or 2 countries which, by virtue of their inheritance, were going to be relatively better off or worse off from these trends, what would the panel members pick? I'll start with you, Leslie.
It's a really It's a really good question, although obviously the way the markets develop, I think you'll have a better chance, of course, to avoid a utility death spiral in a market that just has a more nascent power supply. So if you look at the 16 countries in Africa that have electrification rates of less than 10%, they get so little funding. They get 14% of all funding for energy access just alone, which is both a tragedy and an opportunity at the same time. You look at markets like Sierra Leone that was mentioned on the previous panel, and electrification rates are just so low, and the generation capacity of the utility is just so low vis-a-vis demand or even future demand. So linking it back to the previous panel about leapfrogging, there's probably an opportunity there better than anywhere else. I mean, we know that the process of weaning utilities off of fossil fuels is an inordinate challenge and requires a massive shift in funding dollars from entities like the World Bank and other places where capital provisions are, from fossil fuels to renewables in a really thoughtful way. And I just haven't seen that willingness to provide that level of capital. I mean, we need to add multiple zeros on the amount of capital that they're receiving in order to see a huge shift to renewable power. I think there's an incredible YouTube video. It's a TED Talk by a woman named Rose Matuso that talks about the carbon budget that's remaining in the world and enabling this advocacy that Africa should have the remaining carbon budget, and we should see the development of more fossil fuels, because we cannot forget the development agenda. We cannot say let's wait wait till renewables are cheaper and affordable. It's not fair, it's not just, it's not right. So we do need to see the extreme ramp up of capacity in Africa. But rather than arguing and saying, maybe Africa should get the remainder of the carbon budget, Africa should get the remainder of all of the capital that's out there in terms of access to renewable power and subsidy capital. Because if you link it back to fossil fuels, you're going to face a utility death spiral, you'll have unintended consequences. And beyond that, you're going to hook African countries that don't need to be stuck in a cycle of dependency, which has social issues and economic problems and environmental issues. In moving forward, I think that one way to maybe start avoiding this is just a fundamental shift in the way capital is provided, a recognition that subsidy capital will be provided, kind of a rising of all boats with the tide if we can see just a shift in capital. But to answer your question, I'd say focusing on those 16 nations that have incredibly low electrification rates is probably your best bet to see an avoidance of the utility death spiral. Not to avoid markets where we see mature utilities by any means, but just really thinking thoughtfully about some case studies and models to show that there is another way.
Right. I mean, Zora, maybe we can move on from just the level of maturity of the utility in terms of electrification, but just tariff levels again, because this fascinates me, how little we talk about tariff levels varying from country to country. We tend to talk about tariff levels in one country. If you're a new investor in private generation, on or off grid, you compare it with utility tariffs, but we don't look at those gaps. And I'm fascinated by two countries I've done a bit of work in. One is Zambia, which is not too different in terms of access to capital historically to Kenya, let's say. Okay, it's been through sovereign debt default recently, but similar credit ratings. Slightly lower electrification. I think it's about 25%, which is lower than Kenya's. And yet it's had tariffs historically of 6 US cents a kilowatt hour on average, different consumer and industrial. And Kenya, I think, has been in the high teens, sort of 18, 19 cents on average. I know there are different tariff categories. How are those kind of differences going to shake out in the next few years?
That's a very interesting question, Jonathan. It's something that I've been thinking about lately because when I compare Tanzania to Kenya, I have very close ties with Tanzania because my family moved to Tanzania in early 1900s, so 115 years ago, from India. And my grandfather settled in Zanzibar and then moved to Tanzania, and my parents were both born in Tanzania. So I've been wanting to do solar projects and other projects in Tanzania for a long time. I have family and friends there, and I want to do projects there, but it's so difficult in Tanzania because of TANESCO charging these extremely low tariffs. And so how can we as a private developer compete with 6-cent tariffs when, and unfortunately, TANESCO is not a sustainable business. It's going to be I don't know all the details, but I know that they get a lot of help to remain solvent on every so often years. I know that it's not a sustainable business. So it seems like a bit of a facade to charge this low tariff, when they can't sustain their solvency. So I've always thought that Kenya, while the tariffs are higher, at least KPLC is solvent and is running a sustainable business. So there's a real juxtaposition there between neighboring countries in very differing tariffs. You know, you've got a 6-cent range tariff versus a 16 to 18-cent tariff. Some of our customers, you know, we're not just doing utility scale, we're doing commercial industrial scale projects as well in Kenya and other countries. And I can't believe some of the bills I see from KPLC. I mean, some customers are paying in excess of 20 US dollar cents per kilowatt hour for their electricity. And no wonder they want to go to the private sector. No wonder they want to defect from the grid, because we can offer them half the price or less. So it makes a lot of sense for them to defect from the grid and defect from KPLC. So your question about these differing tariffs, it's a real political issue, I think, from country to country, and how they receive their you know, funding support from the Western world. So it's a tough one. I think it's going to have to even out, and I think it makes sense for some of the tariffs in countries like Tanzania to come up and some of the tariffs in countries like Kenya to come down, because it's too high in Kenya, it's too low in Tanzania, and there's a lot of countries that have, you know, one or the other. And in Kenya, just to finish off here, recently, just a week and a half ago, there's a presidential, there's a PPA task force, because the concern about the high tariffs that customers are paying is really is a political issue, and there's elections coming up next year. So this has come to the fore, and so there's been a PPA task force to look at power purchase agreements and what's being paid to IPPs. And so a developer such as myself, who's got one of the lower tariffs in the PPAs for Malindi Solar, and then other solar developers that are now offering 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour, they're at risk, but really the higher tariffs are being paid to the heavy fuel oil and other plants. So a lot of these PPAs are going to be reviewed and renegotiated, and that really, unfortunately, sends a negative signal to the private sector and to investors. So I think dynamics on both ends of those tariff ranges really need to change, and we need to be somewhere in the middle.
Right. Maybe, Sabi, if we could talk about Nigeria for a second. I mean, Nigeria is the poster child for privatization of utilities, probably the most radical privatization of any country in Africa. Has that privatization helped or hindered dealing with these issues?
Yeah, so that privatization in, I think, 2012, setting up DISCOs was a botched privatization in many ways, and has led to the situation today where most DISCOs, apart from Lagos State's DISCO, is pretty much insolvent. But as Zorabi was saying, it's a political tool. Often state players are involved, if not 100% owned. So I don't see them going insolvent or allowed to become insolvent anytime soon. They'll be propped up, I think, for a long time to come. What I do find interesting, though, in Nigeria, though, is that NERC, the regulator, is very much on the ball, and the mini-grid regulations of 2016, for example, are exemplary for the rest of the continent in laying out a very clear framework in terms of encroachment, interconnection, even looking at the long term, what happens if transmission infrastructure does get into the mini-grid's sphere of concession. So that worked well. The privatization itself in 2012, not really. There's a very interesting case going on now in Kaduna State with this company called Conexo, where the state DISCO is partnering with Conexo for a large investment ranging across transmission infrastructure, mini-grids, and even SHS. So that is, for example, one example that I was referring to in my intro, that actually collaboration, I think, is the dream that we're all hoping for. In Nigeria, I would also say, yeah, I would highlight the mini grids again, just because it's a great example of where if you take the utility death spiral and disaggregate it into the separate components of what makes a utility not work well, it's usually across the entire spectrum. It's the generation asset, it's the transmission, it's the billing, it's the customer management. So if utilities could focus on what they do least worse, then that would, I think, allow them to remain relevant. And when I was working at Rensource, for example, we were speaking with various discos about our mini-grids, working together with their transmission infrastructure to partner together and give a better service. So there are ways, I think, where maybe parts of the utility will go into a death spiral, but parts of them will remain relevant.
Thank you. And Jasper, for you, for two questions. Are there countries that we haven't touched on in this panel that you think are relevant to this? And if we've touched on all the sort of key examples, which ones do you find most attractive to invest in, given these things going on in the utility industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think one country I haven't looked at yet is Ghana, for instance, where we're also active in. And Ghana is an interesting example in that it has a utility which is doing fairly well in providing electricity. So most of the country has reliable electricity. But what we're seeing there is an interesting development that they have an inverted tariff. And you see that often in Africa, that companies pay the highest tariff and households the lowest. And you actually see the opposite in Europe and the US. You want companies with a low tariff because you want to attract them to operate in your state, in your country, and you give households the highest tariff. Now you see the opposite in many African countries because households are voters and you want them to vote for you. But that's causing problems now because the utilities are relying on these commercial industrial customers to pay all their bills. But for them, it's actually easiest to switch because they're big. They have negotiating power, they have power teams, they know what they're doing. And they can go out there to developers and say, I want a solar power system, I want to reduce my dependency on the grid, what tariff can you give me? And lots of them are doing that. And there you see then the utility and regulators trying to stop that, to slow this process down, which at the end will fail ultimately, but what they're trying to do. And you see that in many markets there. Just to add to Nigeria again, because I think Nigeria is such a fascinating example, is one of the reasons utilities are really in trouble in Nigeria is that their tariffs are uncompetitive. And it's exactly what you, Zohrab, had mentioned, right? So if utilities are not allowed to charge a competitive price, a price which they can actually fund their operations, they will just cut down capital expenditure and their service is going to get worse and worse and worse, which is what's happening in Nigeria. And then all of their customers are looking forward to switch somewhere else. And that's what's really happening. And I completely agree with you, Sabi, that collaboration methods is really what we have to look out there for. And I think, especially in Nigeria, it's very possible. It's a place where the utilities, many of them are becoming more flexible, are looking for ways to partner with renewable energy developers and find a way to stay relevant in the market.
Thank you. Well, we're running close to the end of our time, and actually, having said I didn't have a question for the audience, I have taken a leaf out of Tony's book, and I've got one, but I'll first see if any of the audience have burning questions for the panel members. Yes, at the back there.
Maybe not in the next 5 years, but 10 to 15 years, how important do you think that battery storage will be for the death spiral of the utilities in Africa, primarily?
Yeah, maybe I can attempt. So I think it's going to be important. We are actually now commissioning our first project next week, I think, that's trying to remove our customer completely from the grid with battery storage and renewables, and is competitive. There's going to be more and more of those. So we're starting to move now customers completely away from the grid instead of just taking a sliver of their total consumption, replacing with renewables. So it's going to accelerate this development. Of course, we still need lower battery costs. There's a lot of development still has to happen, especially people who operate a lot of night, that's still an issue, but we're getting there.
Anyone else like to comment on that?
Sure. I think in general, when we talk about the utility death spiral, we all know that we need the grid, we need the utilities to stay there. They provide an essential service. So while they're at risk of going extinct, we need them there. So we need to find ways to collaborate. And as Jasper mentioned, there are utilities that are collaborating with private sector. So that's definitely what I see in the future, and I think storage is a big part of that. I think that storage presents a lot of opportunities for the utility to work with private sector where they can provide real good grid benefits. And you see this a lot happening in North America where I have experience. I'm sure it's happening elsewhere around the world, but we need private sector to come in and develop storage, large-scale storage, and it's going to provide a lot of benefits to the grid. The challenge right now is how does that storage get compensated? And so we need to find innovative ways for the storage to get compensated, which makes sense to the private sector, but is not overly costly to the utility.
Any other questions? Well, then I'll again, thanks to Tony for the inspiration. I'm going to wrap up the panel by asking everyone to raise their hands on one question. And let's look out 5 years. Now, I always think 5 years is a period in this industry which we can reasonably, if we're intelligent people, predict. In 5 years' time, looking at the utility across Africa as a whole, how many people in the room think that their credit ratings will have improved? Put your hands up.
Great.
Okay, panel members? No? Okay, how many people think they will have got worse? Okay, on that note, welcome to the Utility Death Spiral, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.